welcome back to the France 24 debate. For those of you just joining us, I'm Annette Young, filling in for Francois Picard. Now, here in France, it's called La Rentrée, that unique French phenomenon that marks the end of the summer holiday, back to school. It's also back to work for politicians, and this Tuesday, President Francois Hollande gave his annual address to the French diplomatic corps, outlining the country's stance on various international issues. This as his own nation is still dealing with a wave of terrorist attacks. But it also begs the question as to just how relevant these days is France on the global stage. Let's take a listen to what President Hollande had to say earlier.
France is a country which, because of its status, its diplomacy, its defence, its culture and the values we hold dear, has a very unique responsibility when it comes to dealing with major global issues today. And this is all the more true in this summer of 2016, when the world faces grave threats. The first of these is terrorism. France has been hit in recent months, but so have our European neighbours and so many other countries throughout the world on every continent.
And here to talk with me about his speech and its implications is Jacques Millard, a parliamentary member of the French opposition party Les Républicains and often a frequent guest here on France 24. Thank you so much for coming in. Also, Yves Bertoncini, the director of the Jacques Delors Institute. Thank you. And Dominique Tricon, also a frequent guest and former head of the French military mission at the UN. Thank you so much for all of you for coming in. Let me start with a question for all three panellists. First of all, Jacques, journalists and diplomats are summoned to what is a ritual at this time of year. It's in a complicated world. Is France still seen, or rather, is it really an indispensable player on the global stage?
Well, it's a question of will and means. First of all, I think that I'm sitting in the opposition and I can criticize, of course, the French government because, in my view today, it has been following too much others, you see, either the Europeans or the Americans. So I regret that, in fact, we don't have an independent policy very clear and you know. The question of means is also that, of course, we are not China, we are not United States, but we have influence. We have influence if we have a very clear diplomacy, very clear position, because France has still, let's say, the momentum, the capacity to initiate things and to push them. And in fact, you know, you don't live, in fact, anymore in a kind of blocks world. You live in a very balkanized world in which, you know, a country like France or Britain or Germany, if they have a clear policy, can really make things move. You see, because nothing is really stuck. It's, you know, take the example of Iraq. Of course, the Americans wanted to have a coalition. We did not follow. At this stage, we gain a lot of sympathy in the world. But so far that you join, you know, others' position, and then the voice of France is becoming unclear. And this is what I criticize today.
Dominic, again, following up from what Jacques was just saying, I mean, this is a country that is dealing with many issues. I mean, the problem of terrorism, a weakened economy. Is it still a voice to be reckoned with?
Yes, I think in the diplomatic terms, France is still a big nation for three main reasons. First part is member of the European Union, and inside the European Union is an important country. Secondly, is a permanent member of the Security Council, which is very important. I spent a long time there, and I can assure you that the role of France in the Security Council is of major importance. The third point is that the link with Africa, in different terms, in diplomatic terms, but also in military terms. France is probably the last country who has still permanent bases in Africa and is able to react very quickly in Africa. That was the case in Mali. That was the case also in Central Africa. And everybody was very happy that France was able to react so quickly. So I think in this three arena, Europe, Security Council for the world diplomacy, and in Africa, France has still a major role to play.
Yves, but is the world still listening to what Paris has to say?
Well, at least many ambassadors, not only the French, were there today listening to François Hollande.
But it's a ritual, isn't it?
Of course, yes, it's a ritual, but very useful one, because, by the way, in terms of means, France has one of the largest diplomatic corps in the world, together with the US and the Brits. So this is important, these tools, the ambassadors, of course, French ambassador going back their countries, but also the foreign ambassadors will listen to François Hollande, and we are writing at the very moment we are speaking, writing telegrams, saying what is at stake. Not only what François Hollande said, it's public, but also what they heard as regards French position, tradition, and interest. So on this, France has a unique voice. It's not the single actor, but it's a voice, if I look at the other European actors, from a country with a universal tradition, an ambition for the world, a kind of Weltanschauung, as we would say in Germany. But, for example, Germany would not take such position, I believe, even if there are also ambassadors come from France. But, I mean, France has a specificity. But, of course, there are two things, having said this. First, the means. Yes, of course, the image of France, if we look at economy, social image, including with the debate around Burkini. This is not very good at the moment. But if you look at security and defense and diplomacy, France is still in a position of leadership in reality. And I quite disagree with Jacques Mir. If I take the major challenge mentioned by François Hollande at the very beginning, which is terrorism, Islamist terrorism, this threat, not only France is on the front line, unfortunately, because we have been hit, not only us, but we have been hit as French people. But it is also, France is in a position of leadership in Sahel. France is in a position of leadership in the Middle East. And the problem was France. The problem of France was not to be followed enough, for example, by the Americans or the Brits when bombing Syria was at stake in 2013. So, of course, it cannot act on its own, as the US could do. But fighting terrorism, France is rather a leader than a follower.
But Jacques, you want to respond to this, but the reality is France, as Yves just said, has taken a battering as a result of all these various other issues. I mean, does that weaken its voice on the global stage?
No, I don't think so. In fact, I think that there is no more in the world hyper power, the hyperpuissance of Védrine. It doesn't exist anymore because the world is not working in blocks. It's a changing world all the time. So on certain issues, you can be with Americans for combating, for instance, the terrorists. On other issues, we saw that on the climate, we were with the Europeans. So, it is a changing world. And in this changing world, France has still the capacity to be the leader on certain issues if France has a clear policy. And I don't agree with you with the leading France in the Middle East or the Near East. It doesn't exist anymore. We made mistakes there. And it was mistakes from Alain Juppé to the present government. So I do believe, in fact, that we did not really assess clearly what was happening in Syria as well as in Iraq. We saw that. But in Syria, we made mistakes. So I do believe that, in fact, there's different geographical places in the world where we can really act. I agree. At the UN, because we are a permanent member, in Africa, but you forgot the Middle East and the Mediterranean, as well in Europe. So you see, well, in Asia, in Latin America, we can lead strategic influence, commercial influence, cultural influence, but we are not there. In Asia and in Latin America, or in the Americas, we are not a military power. We are a military power in Africa, in the Mediterranean Sea, and in Europe.
So France has been weakened?
No, it's not been weakened. The world has changed. United States cannot act everywhere as United States want. And in fact, but we have a message. This is true. And when you analyze what this president say, or the former one, or the one before, and you put the Americans' message, it's the same thing. France and United States have a world message to deliver. And because we believe that what we represent is also a progress, something for the world. But it doesn't mean that we can implement everything as well as the United States.
Yes,
Dominic.
I just want to come back on something. I didn't forget Middle East, but because I agree with you, France is absent of the crisis in Middle East due to the different mistake made by Alain Juppé and by the successive governments, and that was a mistake at that time because we were dealing with moral issue and not real politics. And that was a mistake.
But wouldn't you say, Dominic, that literally every superpower made a mistake about the Middle East?
Yeah,
it wasn't just
I
France.
agree, but we're talking about the French politics, And the second point is that something is very important is the perception of the others about France. And look, after the attacks in France, what was the reaction in the world? And that's very important, that when something happened in France, all the world is looking at France. And so the perception is a bit different. And so that's where the universal message that we've got in France, and that the US probably have got also, is of major importance. And that's give a moral issue, I go back to moral issue for France, to have a word to say on crisis in the world, and not only because we are member of European Union and permanent members of the Security Council, and because of our history with Africa, but because we are France, and France is not is a well-known country in the world, specifically after the revolution.
Yves, this speech, of course, coming by President Hollande in the run-up to next year's presidential elections, just how significant a part will foreign policy play in those elections?
Well, normally not that big a role. For the president, which is trying to run again, it can be an asset because it shows that he's a bit beyond, the others. He's dealing with the global issues or external, very precise threats, terrorism, the neighborhood of the EU. But if we look at the previous elections, it did not help Nicolas Sarkozy, for example, to be re-elected. But of course, François Hollande will use this asset if he wants to be re-elected. The thing is that it's not time for campaigning yet, and if he's doing this today, it's simply because foreign affairs are part of his agenda. I think a dominant part of his agenda. Normally in France, we have a prime minister in charge of, trying to make reforms in France, a government. So he is the head of the army, and then he has to have this global vision. If you look at his agenda in the next few weeks, he's traveling a lot. So he'll try to make a balance between these international tasks, duties, including in terms of the profits he could raise out of them, and of course the domestic agenda and maybe the campaign he would launch. The difficulty he will face is Giscard d'Estaing has said in the 70s. The French people represent less than 1% of the world population. Less than 1% of the world population. It's considerable, I think, the influence of France. If you compare with the importance in terms of demography, we are punching a lot above our weight in terms of demography. But the difficulty we'll always face, it will be the same for his successor, is to try and influence the whole world, being only 1% of the population. And that's why in his speech there's also something, and it's my duty to say this, on the European construction, because of course he has said, not as clearly as de Gaulle, but that the EU can be the Archimedes leverage for France, and that solidarity from the EU can help, and has helped, for example, in the fight against terrorism.
Jacques, I just want to say, though, the one effect of these ongoing terrorist attacks across Europe, not just in France, has been a swing towards the far right, a turning inwards, if you like, and wanting to sort of go back to the old days where, domestic issues are far more important than, say, Europe or being part of the EU. As a result, Do you think foreign policy will be an important issue in next year's presidential election?
No presidential election has been won on foreign policy or European policy. This is as simple as that. So domestic issues will be predominant. There is no doubt about that. And the way, is being, managing the internal affairs, etc. I mean, the dismissal of Mr. Macron today shows that, we say in French, the rats are leaving the vessel, you see? I don't know how you say that in English.
Leaving a sinking ship.
Yeah, are leaving the sinking ships. And it shows that, in fact, he's very, very alone, sole man. And, but the issue for the presidential election will be domestic growth, unemployment, security, which is linked, security,
Yes.
of course, which is linked to what is happening in the world, because we live in a, world village. We live in a world village. And this is why I do believe that, of course, through security, through this question of refugees, for instance, there will be a bit of foreign challenge, but not the foreign policy as such.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We've come to the end of our first part, but don't go anywhere. This conversation is going to continue after a short break. Do stay with us for the second part of the France 24 debate.